This is the Regular Pastor Podcast, a podcast devoted to regular pastors and regular churches. My name is Landon Coleman, a regular pastor here at Emmanuel Baptist Church in Odessa, Texas. This is Season 5 of the Regular Pastor Podcast, in which I'm talking about books and ideas in the day-to-day ministry of regular pastors. The book I want to share with you today is titled Authority: How Godly Rule Protects the Vulnerable, Strengthens Communities, and Promotes Human Flourishing. The author is a well-known author, Jonathan Leeman. This book is published by Crossway. The big boys over at Crossway put this book out in 2023. The book has 278 pages. There's about a dozen pages of index and endnotes at the end, but most of this book is book. And there's a prelude and an introduction at the beginning. And then the book has 5 parts with a conclusion at the end. And so I'm not going to detail every chapter, but I do want to mention to you the 5 parts that make up this book. So part 1 deals with the question, what is authority? 3 chapters there in answering that question. Part 2 deals with the question, what is submission? And there's 2 chapters dealing with this question of submission. Part 3, how does good authority work? And there are 5 chapters here, 5 principles for how good authority works. And then the last part, or the last section, is the most practical. The question at hand in part 4 is, what does good authority look like in action? And there's 7 chapters there that sort of flesh this question of authority out in the context of marriage and parenting and the government and work and a local church. Like I said, there is a conclusion at the end. Let me give you a little bit of author bio on Jonathan Leeman. He has a PhD from the University of Wales. He's the editorial director for 9 Marks, and he is the co-host of Pastors Talk podcast. He's written over a dozen books, a few that you may check out or you may already be familiar with. How the Nations Rage, Church Membership, One Assembly, and then a book titled Church Discipline. So lots of books written by Jonathan Leeman. He also teaches as an adjunct professor at Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary and Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, I should say the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, and also at Reformed Theological Seminary. So he teaches as an adjunct at several different places. Let me give you the big idea, the overarching summary of this book. Leeman starts off noting that as people living in the democratic West, we are skeptical of authority. And we, because of our philosophical background, we prefer the autonomy of the individual. He also notes that in Western churches, American churches, Western churches, the last few decades have been marked by what seems like constant leadership failure and prolific spiritual abuse by clergy. He also notes that our cultural heroes tend to be young people who rebel against unjust authority. And if you want proof for that, you just look at Disney. And the typical Disney hero or princess or whatever, it's typically a young person rebelling against or standing up against unjust authority. So we are very skeptical of authority. And we have been conditioned in recent years, recent decades, to believe that spiritual authorities, spiritual leaders are going to be guilty of abusing and misusing their authority. He notes on page 5 and then moving also on to page 6 that the biblical hero, quote, is the person who is obedient to God. So this is different than our culture. But the biblical hero is a person who obeys God. He talks about Noah and Abraham and Moses and Joshua and Ruth and David and the prophets. Ultimately, he talks about Jesus. So the good guys, the hero in the Bible, is the person who obeys. The bad guys in the Bible are the ones who disobey. And Leeman's making the point right out of the gate that the solution to bad authority is not no authority, it's good authority. And our culture just jumps over the possibility of good authority and says, well, authority has been abused or misused. We want to get rid of it altogether. But that's not the solution. The solution is not no authority. The solution to bad authority is actually good authority. And so the goal of this book is simple. What is good authority? How do we define it? How do we spot it? How do we cultivate it? How do we contrast it with bad authority that seems so common in our culture? So I just want to give you 2-3 quick ideas from the book that I think are helpful, things that you can expect if you pick up this book and read it. In part 1, Leeman offers a broad framework for authority. The question in this section is, what is authority? And he makes a case that authority is rooted in God, in his character, in his purposes, in the fact that he created the world. And he notes that Satan's scheme involves twisting and perverting the authority structures that God has set up. That includes Satan wanting to supplant God himself. And that includes Satan turning God's created structures of authority on their head. He points out, after he notes God's design and Satan's scheme, that Christ came to reclaim and redeem authority, to set it right, to embrace what God had created and to turn back what Satan had set upside down. And so right out of the gate, Leeman is setting this book about authority in a broad biblical context. He's talking about creation, he's acknowledging the fall, and then he's talking about the redemptive work of Christ. Another helpful part of the book, or a helpful idea to note, is in chapter 11. In fact, I think this might be the most helpful part of the book as I read it and as I thought about my responsibilities as a regular pastor. In chapter 11, Leeman talks about 2 types of authority of command and authority of counsel. Authority of command has the right to give directives and to enforce those directives through discipline, and this authority of command is rooted in God's transcendence. When you think about authority of command, you think about parents of young children, you think about the state, and you think about the church as the church most broadly. So that's authority of command. But there's also authority of counsel. Authority of counsel has the right to issue directives, but it does not have the right to enforce those directives through discipline. And the parallel here is not God's transcendence, but it's his immanence. And so when you think about authority of counsel, you think about the authority of a husband over a wife, and you think about the authority of an individual elder over an individual church. I think the distinction that Leeman makes here is really, really helpful. And many of the frustrated regular pastors that I know have not recognized the difference. They have a flattened out view of authority. And they know that a pastor has authority, but then they find themselves in a church that pushes back against their authority, and they think that authority of command is what they've been granted, when what they've really been granted is authority of counsel. And when this is flattened out and the distinction is lost, regular pastors are going to be frustrated when they find themselves trying to lead a congregation. The rest of part 5 is the last big idea that I would mention. And this last section, not part 5, but part 4, he's talking about husbands, and he's talking about parents and the government and bosses or employees or managers in a work context. He's talking about the church. He's talking about elders. And I just think it's a helpful walk through of several levels of authority. Husbands and their wives. Husbands, you have authority of counsel. Parents with your children, you have authority of command. Those serving in government positions, they have authority of command. They've been given the right to bear the sword. Those in a managerial context, those in a business ownership type context, you have authority of command over your employees. The church itself has authority of command over its members, but an individual elder or group of elders or pastors or overseers only has authority of counsel. And I just think it's a helpful way as Leeman breaks these specifics out in individual chapters and talks about authority of command and authority of counsel. Let me give you my favorite quote from the book. In a world like ours that completely hates authority and views power as problematic and wants to flatten out all human relationships and interactions and not have any sort of hierarchy. That's our culture. Leeman says this, quote, "It's worth observing then that our first obligation is to love God's creation design. If we don't love the design, we'll resent the offices." Leeman in this book, he's talking about authority. And at the end of the day, it comes down to what God has revealed in the created order and what God has revealed in Scripture. And if you don't love God's design, and a design that includes authority on multiple levels, you're going to resent the offices, whether those offices are parents or husbands or bosses or the government or pastors or elders or overseers. All the specifics tie back to this fundamental question: do you love God's design in creation as it's revealed in the created order and as it's revealed in Scripture? Look, I'm a Baptist pastor, a Southern Baptist pastor, and so I appreciate the distinction that Leeman makes between the authority of the church and the authority of a pastor. The church as a whole has one authority of command, but an individual pastor, elder, overseer has authority of counsel. And I think this is a very, very helpful idea when it comes to ministry takeaway in this book. I also agree with Leeman's anecdotal observation that most cases of pastoral abuse are cases where there was a single pastor, or there are ruling pastors, or there are individual pastors who have rejected the authority of their presbytery. He's just identifying some ecclesiological anomalies, some issues that tend to enable pastoral abuse or spiritual abuse. And this is just kind of classic Leeman. He's drawing a connection between the way you structure your church and the way you listen to the New Testament in developing your ecclesiology and the way that you exercise authority in a local church setting. These things are not unrelated. Ecclesiology matters when it comes to having a right view of authority and trying to prevent spiritual abuse. I do think that some of these things are worth considering when you, as a potential pastor, are candidating at a church or you're looking for a new church home as a church member, trying to think about how is this church structured and is the structure conducive to a right exercise of authority, and is it conducive to preventing spiritual abuse? When it comes to critique or criticism, I would point to Leeman's chapter on the government, and I think that Leeman probably has a little more faith than I do in the theoretical possibility that a government could be morally and or religiously neutral. I think I would reject those possibilities, but Leeman seems to hold that out. There's a quote that you'll find on page 217 where he talks about the separation of church and state and how do we divide what the state can enforce and not enforce. And he says the separation of church and state does not prevent us from enforcing certain Christian moral convictions in the public square, but it does mean we seek to enforce only those convictions that God authorizes governments to enforce. I agree with the quote, but I'm quite certain that there will be lots of disagreement on which Christian moral convictions God authorizes governments to enforce. The principle he's driving home here is a sound one, but the specifics and the application are likely to engender a lot of disagreement when it comes to evangelical Christians, Reformed Christians, especially as they think about the role of government and the possibility of neutrality and whether or not the government has an obligation to enforce morality and worldview and things related to this. So a little bit of a critique or criticism there, just acknowledging that we're not all going to end up on the same page on that particular issue. Goodreads gives this book a 4.71. It's a pretty strong rating on Goodreads. That may be a result of the fact that the audience is somewhat limited. I gave it a 4-star rating on Goodreads. If you are a person in authority, you may want to read this book. If you're a pastor or a husband or a parent or a politician or a business owner or a manager, there may be something here that is helpful for you. So that's the book, Authority by Jonathan Leeman. Thanks for listening to the Regular Pastor Podcast. Wherever you're listening, you can subscribe for weekly episodes here in Season 5. We're a little over halfway done. We've got about 4 more books to go in this season. You can follow me online at regularpastor.com. You can find me on Goodreads by searching for Landon Coleman. And if you have a book you'd like me to read and review on the podcast, maybe even a book you've written, shoot me an email. Let me know. Landon@emmanuelodessa.com. Until next week, this is the Regular Pastor, out.